Hi, my name is Ben Chapple. Until about a year and a half ago, I worked full-time for Naturetrek, but since then I've been very lucky to do quite a lot of day trips for the company, which I've really enjoyed. But for my day job, I'm now predominantly based at the Zoological Society of London, at the Institute of Zoology, where I work in the African wild dog team. And I will be talking a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing there, but yeah, over the course of the talk. But really this evening, what I'm going to be speaking about is all things African wild dog. This is an absolutely fantastic animal, really, really wonderful, charismatic species. And I know a lot of you will be familiar with them. Many of you will probably have seen them in the wild yourselves. And certainly for passionate wildlife lovers traveling to Africa, this is one of the absolute top target species. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a lot about their ecology and their conservation, some of the threats they face, and then a little bit about where you can go if you really want to see them in the wild. Although I think that has been covered really nicely by some of the previous talks. Now, I thought I'd just start very quickly by showing this evolutionary tree, which gives you an idea of where wild dogs fit in amongst the wider dog family. So you can see I've circled wild dog at the bottom of your screen. You can see they are on this branch that includes at the top there the grey wolf and domestic dog, also some other things like coyote, Ethiopian wolf. And although they are the most distant branch of this little grouping, they are still more closely related to what we might think of as the true dogs than things like side-striped jackal and black-backed jackal, the two African jackal species are. So although they are quite evolutionarily distinct and distinctive from other dog species, they remain very much a part of the dog family, not quite so distant as we might have imagined in the past. Now, it is also a highly endangered species. It's the second most endangered large carnivore in Africa, after the Ethiopian wolf. Now, in the early 20th century, it was estimated that the population of African wild dogs might have run into the hundreds of thousands. Sadly, today, it's just a tiny percentage of that. The most recent estimate is about 6,000 adult wild dogs, only 1,400 of which are actually mature adults. And yeah, so before they were systematically eradicated from most of Africa, they really would have existed in pretty much all habitats other than the densest tropical forests and the driest deserts. They're incredibly adaptable. Wherever there's enough prey for them, they're generally capable of surviving. But now they're only found in around 13 or so of their original 40 range states. And you can see this very fragmented distribution across Africa. It's likely that no single subpopulation that's left on the continent has more than 250 mature individuals. So even in their greatest strongholds, they're still very precariously placed, which is worrying. Now, they face a pretty wide variety of threats, the biggest of which historically has certainly been habitat loss. Now, habitat loss has affected wildlife across the world and across Africa, but wild dogs are almost unusually vulnerable to it because they are one of the most wide-ranging of all mammals. A pack of African wild dogs could have a home range that stretches into the hundreds of square kilometers, perhaps even in certain situations into the thousands of square kilometers. And so unless you have a truly vast area of relatively undisturbed habitat, even the biggest national parks in Africa, and Africa of course has some of the most spectacular, broadest of landscapes for wildlife in the world, actually it's pretty unlikely that you're going to have enough space to conserve a viable population of African wild dogs. And that's a big reason why they've disappeared from so much of their former range. Persecution has also been a big problem and actually continues to be one. In fact, in a lot of national parks, even up until quite late in the 20th century, that the policy was to shoot wild dogs because they were considered vermin. So in the Kruger National Park in South Africa, in the first few decades after the park was proclaimed, thousands of wild dogs were killed. Deliberately by park management because they perceived them to be a threat to game. And thankfully that kind of attitude has completely changed now, but they are still vulnerable to persecution when they come up against farmers and when they do occasionally take livestock. They're also quite vulnerable to snares. Because they're so wide-ranging, they often move out of strictly protected areas into places with high human population and areas where there's lots of hunting. And although those snares are probably set for other animals, wild dogs are often caught up in them. Disease is also a big problem for wild dogs. They're very vulnerable to a lot of diseases that are carried by other predators, including domestic dogs. And so the area that my team at ZSL works on mostly is the Laikipia area of northern central Kenya. And up until a few years ago, this was one of the biggest single populations left in Africa. But over the course of just a few months, 3 or 4 years ago, all but 3 adults in this population were killed, died of canine distemper virus. It was an extraordinary die-off, and it coincided with a drought which was pushing pastoralists into wildlife areas, bringing their domestic dogs and bringing those dogs into close proximity with the wild dogs. Yeah, it really was a devastating event. And the problem is that because there are so few areas where wild dogs are completely insulated from contact with people, this threat of disease and disease transmission, particularly from domestic dogs, is really not going anywhere anytime soon. Another big threat, which I will talk about a little bit later, is climate change. Climate change does seem to be a bit of a problem for wild dogs, and that's something that I've been working on. We'll talk a little bit about why that's the case in a few minutes. Now, wild dogs are a pack animal. Across their range, the average pack size tends to be around 10 individuals. It does vary. There are packs nowadays that can reach 30 or 40, maybe even more than that in exceptional situations. But there are historical records of maybe questionable validity, but that indicate that there may have been aggregations of wild dogs in the past that went even into triple figures. Those are unlikely to have been stable packs if they were true, but that gives you a bit of an indication of just how severely wild dogs have been affected by loss of habitat and other threats over the last century in particular. Now, wild dogs have quite an unusual, quite an interesting reproductive system, quite an interesting reproductive biology. So within that pack of however many individuals, there will be just a single alpha pair, an alpha male and female, that monopolize, almost all the time, monopolize the breeding. So they will be the only individuals within the pack that reproduce. And other adults within the pack, generally speaking, are only involved in helping that alpha pair to raise their offspring. Now, although the male, alpha male, tends to have gotten that position through fighting, through conflict with other males, generally speaking, more often than not, the female gets into that position simply by being the most senior, the oldest female in the pack. But yeah, so it's an interesting situation. This is an alpha female here. You can see she's this one had actually just given birth to pups. She's really, really swollen. You can see those great big teats for the milk. Now, in southern Africa, wild dogs tend to den, or they do den in the southern winter, in the dry season. That can be a really great, reliable time to see them if you know the location of a den. I know Georgie was talking a little bit earlier about packs in some areas that are monitored with radio collars, and if that's the case, and if you're somewhere that has access to that sort of tracking technology, then seeing wild dogs can sometimes be no easier than when they're denning, because they are confined to a relatively small area around the den. Now, the pups for the first few months of their lives are confined to the den, and during that time, when the dogs go out hunting, they will leave an adult, at least one adult there to babysit. But by the time they're a couple of months old, they will actually join the pack on the move, even though they remain extremely small. Now, because wild dog reproduction is basically monopolized by this alpha pair, and by definition, the pups will be their offspring, if a young wild dog wants to reproduce itself, it will have to disperse. It'll have to leave its natal pack. And they do that in single-sex dispersal groups. And when they're off, they'll be looking for either another single-sex dispersal group of the opposite sex to join up with and make a new pack, or actually sometimes they will just join an existing pack and hope to work their way up within the hierarchy of that pack, which will be made up of unrelated individuals. And actually, this dispersal period is an incredibly important part of their lives. It's probably the most important time. You know, they are facing huge amount of danger. They're traveling large distances into areas that they're very unfamiliar with. And often the kind of threats that they'll be facing there will be highly, highly magnified. And it's a time in a wild dog's life that we know very little about at the moment. And there's a lot more research to do to help us to work out how best to conserve them. Now, wild dogs are crepuscular in terms of their activity. So generally speaking, they are most active in the first few hours of the day around dawn, and then again, just immediately prior to dusk. And after they've gone out for a morning hunt, they'll tend to spend the hottest part of the day lying about somewhere cool, often in these amazing kind of very endearing bundles of dog. They love each other's company. They're very keen on physical touch and all that kind of stuff. I sort of think this, when you look at and see them like this, it almost looks almost perfectly like sort of dappled leaves, sunlight dappling leaves under the shade of a nice tree. So they're often very camouflaged too. But then as the afternoon wears on and things cool down, they start to pick up their activity again. And often one of the first things that happens is they do these incredible greeting rituals, these amazing kind of whirring displays where they all tear around each other, making these incredible whistling and squeaking noises. Really clear that they're absolutely exhilarated in each other's company. It's a really fantastic, incredible thing to watch. It does have a purpose, so it's partly to reinforce the bonds that they have between individuals, which might be important in the hunt that's coming up. It's also kind of interesting that they are, this was shown a few years ago, that one of the things they're doing is they're actually deciding whether to go hunting at all. And the way they do this is actually by sneezing. So some of you may have heard this story a few years ago when it was revealed by a team in Botswana. Actually, the dogs, while they're doing these displays, they are exhaling very audibly. And if a majority of dogs within the pack sneeze, then the pack will set off hunting. If they don't, then they'll go and settle down again, go back to sleep, and maybe try again in a few minutes. But the alpha pair have more votes than the rest of the pack. So if the alpha pair decide that it's time to go hunting, it doesn't matter whether the other dogs want to go or not. The hunt will go ahead and happen. Now, when they're hunting quite a wide variety of different antelope. Although across most of their range, so most of the places where wild dogs are found, impala, which is this species here, is the most important prey item. So wild dogs are, they weigh about 20 to 30 kilos on average themselves, and their favorite prey size is about 50 kilos, and that sort of fits impala pretty much perfectly. Greater kudu is also a popular prey item, and in some areas they will target a lot of smaller stuff. Particularly in areas maybe outside of formally protected areas where the density of really large ungulates might be a bit lower. And very, very occasionally, they might take something larger. So there are records of them killing things as big as buffalo, but that would be pretty rare. And that would be a pretty serious effort of cooperation between a pack to bring down something that probably could weigh more than 10 times as much as a wild dog. Now, wild dogs are known as cursorial hunters. So that basically means that they tend to chase their prey down, sometimes over very long distances, and effectively wear them out until they collapse with exhaustion and they can be killed. And that's in contrast to, say, the ambush tactics of predators like lions and leopards. Now, this is a picture I took in Madikwe Game Reserve in South Africa a few years ago. These dogs chasing a very unfortunate female kudu into this little lake. She did actually get away and stood for hours in the shallows while the pack kind of gazed longingly at what should have been their dinner. Eventually, they had to give up when it got dark, and the kudu, made an escape. For how long, I'm not sure. Now, you may well have seen some of the sort of documentary footage of wild dogs hunting. And one of the classic sort of examples of wild dog hunting that's often shown on TV are these incredibly elongated, prolonged chases across very open countryside, where they're chasing something like this blue wildebeest here. And although, yes, dogs are capable of doing this, this is a way they hunt. Generally speaking, this is very atypical. Wild dogs are really not a species of open habitats. They much prefer denser bushy areas, where these kind of really prolonged chases are a bit more difficult because there are many more opportunities for the prey item to slip out of sight. And in fact, what's much more typical in these environments where kind of coordination between individuals is much harder to achieve, it's a bit of a free-for-all, actually. The dogs are essentially chasing things spontaneously whenever they see them, hoovering up little antelope like dik-dik. So in Kenya, where I mostly work, the most important prey item for wild dogs there are these Gunter's dik-diks. Very small animals. They barely stop even to eat them. They just sort of hoover them up and carry on going. They also love to hunt from roads, which can be a fantastic thing if you're visiting one of these parks. The roads provide kind of quiet, efficient travel through the bush, enable them to find antelope without having to push through dense vegetation. Now, they have acquired a sort of reputation in the past as being a bit of a slightly brutal killer, and that is because they sometimes do start eating their prey before it's actually dead. There are important reasons for this, which I'll go into shortly. And actually, in fact, when they do make a kill, there's quite an established protocol for what happens and the established relationships between the dogs at the kill. So it's likely that in this kind of free-for-all, this melee where dogs are going off after different antelope all at different times, that the dogs that do make a kill might do it without the knowledge of a lot of the rest of the pack. So what they'll do, more often than not, is they'll try and eat as quickly as they can the bits of the carcass that are most nutritious. So that could be the liver, that could be some of the other internal organs. They then call the other dogs in, the other dogs arrive, and as soon as that happens, it's the pups, particularly the pups younger than a year old, that are actually allowed to eat first. So the dogs on the kill will make way for those youngest individuals. It's only after the pups have finished eating that the alpha pair come in. And then finally, after the alpha pair have had their fill, the adult dogs that weren't involved in making the kill get to have a share themselves. And that's really interesting because, for one thing, it means that the youngest individuals in the pack, who might otherwise be the most vulnerable, are actually always well fed and have the best opportunity possible to develop. It also means that adult dogs who aren't the alphas are highly incentivized to be involved in hunting, because otherwise they run the risk of not getting any food at all. It's also really important for the pack to come together around the kill, because they have to be incredibly vigilant. In particular, they have to look out for spotted hyena, which is a kleptoparasite for wild dogs. It means they often steal wild dog kills, and that can be really problematic for wild dogs. They also have to watch out for lions. Lions will take their food as well, but even more importantly, lions often kill wild dogs. So under relatively undisturbed conditions, it's lions that are by far the biggest cause of wild dog mortality. And actually, so this pack here that I'd seen make a kill in the Kruger National Park in South Africa, they were resting after making the kill, and then suddenly this lioness, out of nowhere, didn't even see her, came shooting in, grabbed one of the wild dogs and killed it, and sent the rest of the pack absolutely scattering. So not being vigilant around kills can be a huge problem for wild dogs, and they really do need to watch out for lions and hyenas. Now, I mentioned the impact of climate change on wild dogs briefly earlier. Now, it's actually their hunting behavior that seems to be the reason why they are vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Now, when temperatures are persistently hot, wild dogs tend to have higher mortality, so more of them die. More of the pups die as well, which means their reproductive success goes down. And there are some clues as to why that might be. So on days with higher temperatures, wild dogs tend to hunt for a shorter period of time in the morning and in the evening. They also, when it's hotter, give up chases much more quickly. So it seems like there's actually this risk when it's hotter of them overheating. And there seems to be this direct physiological impact of higher temperatures on wild dogs. And basically what that means is if temperatures keep going up, wild dogs are actually going to have fewer and fewer opportunities to hunt, and their food intake might go down. And that could be part of the explanation for why they do badly at high temperatures. The other reason could be that they are, when temperatures are really high, it's been shown that wild dogs hunt more at night to compensate for the fact that they couldn't hunt during the day. And given that wild dogs spend most of their time doing their absolute best to avoid coming into contact with lions and hyenas, hunting at night when those animals are much more active is clearly an act of desperation, basically. And so if they're forced to hunt more at night to compensate for not being able to hunt so well in the daytime, that means they're coming into contact with lions and hyenas more often, losing more of their food, and presumably getting killed more often by the lions as well. Now, I will just, in the last few minutes, I will just go very briefly through some of the places that I think are great places to look for wild dogs. Now, the Selous Game Reserve, which I believe has now been renamed as Nyerere National Park in Tanzania, has the largest single population of wild dogs in one protected area. The Selous is something like 50,000 square kilometers. It's an absolutely vast, vast area. And that can be a good place to go. Northern Botswana, as Paul mentioned earlier, is a fantastic place to see wild dogs. In fact, the whole area between eastern Namibia all the way through northern Botswana into western Zimbabwe is a wonderful, wonderful place to see wild dogs, amongst a whole variety of other wildlife that lives, particularly around the Okavango Delta, which is one of the most spectacular places for nature in the world. A place where you can explore on Mokoro like this. South Luangwa, which Georgie mentioned earlier, is an increasingly great place to see wild dogs. The population there seems to have gone up quite considerably in the last few years. And as she mentioned, in the green season, actually, it can be quite, they can be very reliable. I'm just going to mention for the last couple of minutes that the Kruger National Park in South Africa, which has quite a sizable population of wild dogs. The latest estimate is between 300 and 350 individuals. It's a spectacular park, a place that you can drive in yourself. Naturetrek also runs some fantastic tours here. And because you have the opportunity there on this very expansive network of roads to travel really widely, travel quite long distances, you actually have quite a good chance of pinning down wild dogs, even if they are moving about quite considerably. Beautiful, beautiful animals. This was a pack I spent most of the day with a few years ago when I was traveling in Kruger. It's a great place to see rhinos as well, although less and less so, sadly, now with the poaching crisis. Hyenas too, which lovely to see for people, not so good for wild dogs. A great place to see leopard. Cheetah are there as well. It's a fantastic place for all sorts of wildlife, including wild dogs, impala. And I haven't mentioned birds so much today, but all the places where you go where you'd see wild dogs are fantastic for birding, and some of the bird life around camps and around the bush is just incredibly charismatic and incredibly interesting. This is an African Scops owl. So I'll just finish by saying something very briefly. I have talked a little bit about the impacts of climate change on African wild dogs, and I think it can sometimes be tempting to think that, therefore, visiting them, flying to Africa to see wild dogs, might not be in their interests, and that therefore staying at home and not going to see them would be the best thing you could do to support their conservation. And of course, we do absolutely have to be careful about our impacts on the environment and examine those and make as many improvements as we possibly can. But in fact, the indications are that without tourism, wild dogs would really suffer. So most of the areas that they still survive in, most of their greatest strongholds, are heavily reliant on tourism to support their conservation, to fund the work that goes on there. And without tourism, a lot of those places would deteriorate, and we're seeing some of that with COVID. So all I would say is that don't think that that avoiding going and seeing wild dogs is in their best interest. It probably isn't. As long as you're sensible, and if you're careful to pick a trip that is sensitive to their needs and is plugged in with local community conservation programs, and that provides incentives to local people to look after their wildlife, then actually I really do believe that traveling to see wildlife, and particularly to see wild dogs, remains in their best interest and remains a fantastic thing to do to help their conservation. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed listening. And yeah, I think we've got a Q&A coming up now.